They say motherhood begins with birth. Mine began with a whisper. He was 6 years old, standing behind his father's leg like a shadow, thin arms crossed, cheeks stained with dried cereal milk, and the kind of silence that told me everything before he ever did. I didn't give birth to Jeremy, but I gave him everything else. And in the end, that's what made this a revenge story, just not the kind anyone expected. When I met Carl, I was 38 and had already accepted the idea that I'd grow old alone, not unhappily. I had a quiet life. I taught second grade at a small school in Springfield, Missouri. I had my books, my weekend garden, and enough casseroles frozen in the garage freezer to feed a whole church. That kind of life, simple, quiet, warm. Then came Carl, and with him, Jeremy. Carl was a widower, kind man. Broad hands, always smelled like sawdust and coffee. He had the kind of voice that made you lean in when he spoke, not because he was loud, but because he made you want to hear him. We met at the library of all places. He was asking for books on second grade reading comprehension. I was stocking shelves. I offered to help. He offered to take me to coffee. 3 months later, I was standing in his living room, a stranger to the quiet boy sitting on the couch with his knees pulled into his chest, eyes fixed on a blank TV screen. His name was Jeremy. 6 years old. Didn't say much. Didn't need to. His silence said it all. His mother, Carl's late wife, had passed from cancer the year before. They'd only just moved into Missouri to be near Carl's extended family, but the loss had knocked the air out of their little world. Carl kept busy. Jeremy stayed frozen. And I, for reasons I didn't fully understand at the time, leaned in. I didn't plan to become a mother. Not in the paperwork sense, not in the heart-shaking, soul-tethering sense either. But then one night, early that winter, he had a nightmare. I was sleeping on the couch back then, still feeling like a guest. The dream must have jolted him awake. He came into the living room, dragging his blanket behind him like a ghost. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just climbed onto the couch beside me, tucked himself under my arm, and whispered one word, "Mama." That's all it took. Not a signature, not a courtroom, just that word, spoken in the dark with complete trust, as if I had been his all along. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, thinking, if he ever stops calling me that, I don't know if I'll survive it. Carl and I married the next spring. There were no formal adoption papers. He said it wasn't necessary. It's just paperwork, he told me once. He knows who loves him. I believed him. For years, I believed him. I became Jeremy's mother in every way that mattered. I packed his lunches, drove him to soccer, kissed every scraped knee, and stayed up through every flu. I taught him how to fold laundry, to write thank you cards, to make eggs that didn't taste like rubber. When his pet hamster died, I held him while he cried for nearly an hour, even though I was terrified of rodents and trying not to cry myself. The photos on the mantle showed 3 people smiling in a yard full of falling leaves. The Christmas cards went out every year with our names handwritten in gold. Helen, Carl, Jeremy. We were a family, and even though the world never handed me a certificate saying I was his mother, I earned the title with every quiet act, every bedtime story, every lunch packed with a note that said, "You've got this." I never asked for much in return. That's the thing no one tells you about women like me, the not-quite mothers, the almosts. We love with no safety net. We give with no guarantee. We show up to every parent-teacher conference, knowing they'll call us stepmother, and we'll smile like it doesn't hurt. It does, but we smile anyway. Because when you love a child like your own, there's no halfway. Even after Carl passed, I stayed. Jeremy was in college by then, independent, strong, didn't need much. But I still sent care packages with socks and cookies. I still paid the gas bill when he forgot. I still waited by the phone every Sunday evening, hoping for the weekly call that came less and less. And when he finally did call, it was always brief, rushed. "Sorry, I've got to run, Mom, but yeah, I'm doing good." He called me Mom. Still, that was enough. I thought it meant something. It would be years before I realized that love at least the kind I gave, wasn't being returned. It was being tolerated, filed away, useful, until it wasn't. But back then, I didn't know that. I still believed in the power of unconditional love. I still thought I was building something that couldn't be erased. I still thought I mattered. And that's the cruelest part of stories like mine. The betrayal doesn't happen all at once. It happens in inches. A missed birthday, a locked drawer, a look that lasts too long and says, "Why are you still here?" But none of that had happened yet. Not in chapter 1. In chapter 1, I was just a woman with a casserole in the oven, a boy I loved like breath, and the quiet certainty that everything I had given would come back to me eventually. I was wrong, but I wouldn't know that. Not yet. Not until the brakes failed. The first time I felt it, that shift, that quiet turning of the tide, was the Thanksgiving after Carl passed. Jeremy came late. No apology, just a shrug and a mumbled, "Traffic was hell." I had cooked everything, stuffing, candied yams, green bean casserole. I even woke up at 5 a.m. to make that stupid pecan pie he used to beg for as a kid. He didn't touch it, and his smile, if you could call it that, didn't reach his eyes. He sat at the far end of the table, tapping on his phone between bites like he was somewhere else entirely. I told myself he was grieving, that maybe he didn't know how to be around me without his father. But even then, something inside me whispered, "This isn't distance, it's detachment." After dinner, as I packed leftovers into Tupperware, he leaned against the counter and said, "Do you still have the deed to the house? I could help you sort through all that legal stuff if you want." He said it casually, smiling, but something about the way he said help made my stomach turn. I laughed it off. "I've lived here longer than you have, Jeremy. I know where I keep the papers." He chuckled, shrugged, "Just trying to save you some stress." That was the first drawer he tried to open, with charm, not force. I didn't see it as a warning. I thought it was just grown-up life. But I wonder now, have any of you ever looked back at a moment and realized it was the beginning of the unraveling, but you were too hopeful to see it then? Tell me in the comments, what was your first sign moment? Sometimes the smallest cracks tell the biggest truths. Winter came, and with it, silence. Jeremy stopped calling regularly. Texts became one-word answers. He came by the house only when something needed checking. The water heater, the gate lock, the mailbox. I didn't notice how often he checked the mailbox until Grace, my neighbor across the street, mentioned it. "He doesn't wave anymore," she said one morning over tea. "Just walks up, grabs your mail like he's looking for a prize, then drives off." I laughed nervously. "He's probably looking for those Medicare letters I keep forgetting to open." Grace didn't smile. She just stirred her tea and said, "He doesn't act like a son, Helen. He acts like an auditor." That sat in my chest for days. An auditor, not family, not love, just someone measuring what's left and how soon it can be his. Still, I let it go. Because it's hard to admit when your heart might be lying to you. Harder still when the lie feels like love. One evening, Jeremy brought over a new laptop. "Thought you could use an upgrade," and he said, placing it on the kitchen table like a gift. I was touched. I really was. Until I opened it later and saw he'd already installed a folder labeled Home Docs Sorted. Inside were scanned PDFs, property tax forms, my will from 5 years ago, bank statements I'd never shown him. "How did you get these?" I asked the next time he visited. He shrugged. "I was just organizing. Figured I'd save you the trouble." My chest tightened. I hadn't asked for help. And yet, here it was. My life, digitized and sorted under his name. He smiled like he'd done me a favor. I smiled back, because I didn't know what else to do. Months passed. Small things added up like breadcrumbs no one thought I'd follow. The front lock was changed one day. "For security," Jeremy said. My spare keys went missing for a week. "Must have dropped them," he shrugged. And the day he brought me a weekly pill organizer, already filled, already labeled, something inside me felt cold. "You don't trust me to take my own meds?" I asked lightly. "I just want to make sure you're okay, Ma," he said, placing it on the counter like a line he expected me not to cross. That "ma," it still felt sweet, still sounded real, but the tenderness behind it had vanished. It was like someone saying, "Bless you," out of habit, not care. He still called me Mom, but I was starting to wonder if he remembered why. That spring, my doctor told me I needed to cut back on driving. Jeremy was thrilled. "I'll handle errands," he said quickly. "No need for you to stress." I told him I'd still drive short distances. He insisted. "You never know what could happen," he added. "Brake lines can wear down without warning." He smiled again. And I, the woman who once rocked him to sleep through thunderstorms, felt a chill crawl up my spine. I looked into his face, grown now, confident, well-dressed. And for the first time in my life, I saw a stranger. The morning of the accident was quiet. No rain, no traffic, no distractions. Just me, a grocery list folded neatly in my coat pocket, and the smooth hum of the car beneath me as I headed down the hill outside Oak Ridge Lane, the same road I'd driven for nearly 25 years. I knew that hill, every bump, every turn. I could have driven it blindfolded. But when I pressed the brake at the bottom of the curve, nothing happened. No resistance, no slow glide, just empty space beneath my foot. A silent failure, a heartbeat. Then the sound of tires screaming without traction. Then nothing. They told me later it was a miracle I survived. The car clipped a stop sign, veered off into a shallow ditch, and somehow I missed the telephone pole by inches. I remember the ambulance siren faintly, like it was part of someone else's memory. I remember pain blooming across my ribs like spilled ink. I remember hands over my chest, voices muffled by morphine. But most of all, I remember waking up and hearing his voice, not with worry, with annoyance. "She's not even our real family," Jeremy said, his voice sharp, flat like someone discussing the weather. "Why should we be responsible?" And then a woman's voice, not a nurse, but someone younger, colder. "I just hope she doesn't make it. It would be easier. The estate's almost ready anyway." It would be easier. That's what my life had become to them, an inconvenience. I lay there, breathing through machines, unable to move, tubes in my veins, heart monitor beeping on steady, too steady, while they discussed me like I was an expired parking meter. My eyes were closed, but my ears were wide open. "She didn't even legally adopt us," Jeremy continued. "She just married Dad. That doesn't mean we owe her anything." I felt something break inside me, not like a bone, not like the crash. It was worse, because it didn't make a sound. When they left, after the nurse politely asked them to step out, I stared at the ceiling tiles and pretended I hadn't just heard the two people I raised since they were children casually wish me dead. I replayed it, over and over, like a tape I couldn't stop. She just married Dad. She's not our real family. The estate's almost ready. It would be easier if she didn't make it. I had loved them with my whole life. I cooked. I cried. I cleaned. I gave and gave and gave. And now, I was just in the way. I used to tell myself that love was louder than law, that even without paperwork, Jeremy knew who had stayed when his birth mother left, who packed his school lunches, who held him through nightmares, who kept the family going after his father passed. But the truth was, they never saw me as real. I was a placeholder, convenient when they needed something, invisible the rest of the time. And now I was disposable. They weren't just waiting for me to die, they were hoping for it. I wanted to scream, to sit up, to grab them by the collars and say, I was there every time when no one else was. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. So instead, I lay still. Because something inside me had already gone quiet, not from fear, but from clarity. I understood, finally, that the love I gave wasn't theirs to return. It was mine to reclaim. I kept flashing back to last December, the afternoon I offered to help Jeremy pay off a loan. I had overheard them then, too. "She's loaded," his girlfriend had whispered. "She just wants to use it to control us." They made kindness sound like a weapon, and I, God help me, I still baked him a pecan pie that week, hoping that maybe sweetness could soften whatever had hardened between us. But love isn't a boomerang. You don't throw it out and expect it to circle back. Sometimes it just drops, quietly, like a woman alone in a hospital bed, whose brakes just happened to fail. And that's when the thought landed. What if it wasn't an accident? The brakes hadn't screeched. They'd gone silent, like they were never there at all. I remembered Jeremy asking for my car keys a few days before. "Just checking your tire pressure, Ma," he'd said, already pocketing the fob. I remembered how the seat had been pushed forward when I got the car back, how the mirrors had been adjusted, how I couldn't see clearly out the back. Little things, breadcrumbs, on their own, nothing. Together, enough to make me listen to the voice in my chest that had started whispering, this wasn't fate, this was orchestration. And suddenly, I wasn't scared anymore. I was awake. Jeremy had already written me off, already planned the funeral. What he didn't know, what he would never expect, was that I had more strength left in silence than he had in all his schemes. The woman he tried to erase, she was still here, and she wasn't done yet. The hardest part about waking up wasn't the pain. It was the knowing, not wondering, not doubting, not hoping, just knowing. I knew what Jeremy had done. I didn't have the full picture yet. Not the receipts, not the proof, not the timeline, but I didn't need all that to feel what had settled in my bones. The betrayal wasn't just emotional anymore. It was strategic. The hospital room was cold, sterile, always too quiet at night. That's when the thoughts came. Long, uninvited guests pulling up a chair beside my bed, whispering what I already suspected. The brakes hadn't failed. They'd been helped along. The man I raised, held through chicken pox and middle school heartbreak, had looked at me and seen a line item, a house, a policy, a number to calculate and wait out. And for what? Because I wasn't the mother he wanted? Because I didn't have a bloodline, only a history? Late one night, Nurse Diane came in to check my vitals. She moved slower than the others, softer. She didn't look at me like a chart. She looked at me like a person. Her fingers wrapped around my wrist, gentle. Then she paused. I blinked, once slowly, and she saw it. "You're aware," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. I blinked again. She leaned closer. "You're not just healing, are you? You're remembering." This time, I blinked twice. Deliberate. She didn't ask anything more, just rested her hand on mine and said, "Then let's make sure someone's listening." 3 days later, a man showed up during the lunch shift. No badge, no clipboard, just a navy windbreaker and quiet shoes. He stood at the foot of my bed, hands in his pockets. "I'm Elliot," he said. "You hired me once before, divorce investigation. Ring any bells?" I blinked once. "Yes." He smiled. "Good, because I've already pulled hospital visitor logs. Your car's an impound, brake lines cut clean. No wear, no rust. Someone wanted it to look like age, but it's new, deliberate, clean." He slid a photo onto my tray. It showed the bottom of my car, zoomed in to a place I'd never thought to look. The brake line was frayed, not naturally, but in a way that only someone trying to fake wear would cut. I didn't cry, not anymore. I just stared at it. Because now it wasn't suspicion, it was fact. Elliot glanced at the door and lowered his voice. "I also pulled a hospital surveillance footage. Your son logged onto the visitor Wi-Fi 2 days after the crash, opened a document labeled Advanced Directive Template, then closed it like nothing happened." My blood turned to ice. That wasn't just planning, that was erasure. He didn't want to care for me. He wanted to prepare for my exit and write the script himself. Diane wheeled in a clipboard later that night. 1 page. My hand shook too much to hold a pen, so she guided me gently. The signature was ugly, jagged, but it was enough. Enough to trigger a legal investigation under elder endangerment. Enough to say, "I am not as helpless as you think." I remembered something Jeremy had said just 2 months earlier in passing, over coffee. "You should update your will. Simplify it. I can help." He smiled when he said it. Warm, like always. The kind of smile Carl used to wear when he was trying to smooth over something. I nodded, told him I'd think about it, and then I forgot. Or maybe I didn't forget. Maybe I just trusted him. That was my mistake, because Elliot found the new version of my will on a private server, a PDF with my name typed at the bottom, not signed, not filed with my lawyer, just waiting. It named Jeremy as the sole beneficiary. April wasn't listed. The women's shelter wasn't mentioned. Not even the earrings I wore to Carl's funeral. Wiped clean. I could have fallen apart right then. I almost did. But then I remembered something Grace once said to me years ago while we sat on her porch drinking lemonade. They start erasing you quietly, Helen. One drawer, one nickname, one decision at a time. And here we were. He tried to erase me. And now I was going to write myself back in. That week, I had Diane send word to Russell Dean, my real attorney, the one Jeremy didn't know about. I had updated my will 3 months earlier, after overhearing something I couldn't unhear. Jeremy laughing in the living room, telling his girlfriend, "Just give it a couple years, she'll croak. The house is mine." She laughed too, said maybe I'd leave it to a cat or a church out of spite. That night, I opened a manila envelope and slid out a photo. Me holding April's hand in the backyard 20 years ago. Her eyes wide, her cheeks sticky with watermelon, and a hand-drawn Mother's Day card stuck to her shirt. "Still your girl," it said. I took that photo to Russell the next day. "I want her to have everything," I said. He looked up, surprised. "Everything?" "Everything." Jeremy didn't know I had changed it. He thought his plan was foolproof. But he forgot the one thing you can't ever predict. A woman who's been quiet for too long, and finally decides not to be. They thought I was resting, healing, drifting. In truth, I was preparing. Every beep of the heart monitor, every tray of bland hospital food, every polite nod from a nurse, it was all time bought. Time I used to think, to listen, to plan. I didn't want revenge. I wanted freedom. The kind you have to build yourself when no one hands it to you. Elliot came back during a shift change when the halls were loud and the nurses were too busy counting meds to watch room 214. He carried a manila envelope and the calm kind of focus only someone who's seen darkness without blinking could have. "We've got enough to open the case formally, son," he said, spreading out photos across my rolling tray like playing cards. Jeremy at my mailbox, Jeremy adjusting my car mirror, Jeremy at the hospital logging into Wi-Fi under a fake name, the brake line photo, the folder on his desktop labeled Directive Draft. It was all there. I stared at each image, slow and deliberate. This wasn't paranoia anymore. It was a timeline. A timeline he never thought I'd live to see. Russell called that afternoon. Diane held the phone to my ear. His voice was steady, legal, clean. "The new will is sealed and stored. We've secured backups. There's no way for them to contest it without exposing the forgery." I blinked twice. Our agreed-upon signal for good. "Now," he added, his tone shifting, "we need to think about your exit." That night, while the city buzzed on the other side of the window, Diane wheeled in a clipboard with one final form, a discharge transfer. It was fake, but only just. Filed through an independent physician on Russell's team. Signed, notarized, clean. At 2:42 a.m., I left the hospital wrapped in a quilt Grace had made years ago, navy blue with stitched daisies along the border. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Grace had left her porch light on. She met us at the curb like we were sneaking out of a crime scene. Diane helped me into the car. Grace sat in back, clutching a thermos of lemon tea like it was sacred. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded. For now. Elliot drove us across 2 county lines, all the way to a small rental house tucked behind a nursery, a place with no records, no cameras, no memories, just air, just space to breathe. In that silence, I started over, not loudly, not dramatically, just slowly. I slept through the first 3 days, woke up only to drink broth and read the same letter from April over and over again. "Still your girl, love, April." It steadied me, because even if I had been erased in one world, I still lived in another. in memories that hadn't been rewritten, in the heart of someone who still called me Mama H. The first thing I did, once I could stand without shaking, was open a new checking account. Then I called the shelter April worked for and asked them to expect a donation in someone's name. I didn't say whose. They didn't ask. Next, I transferred the deed of my house to a trust. Not a flashy move, but a solid one. Russell filed it under the name Blue Finch Trust, the kind of name no one would look twice at. The trust would then sell it for exactly $1 to April. Jeremy wouldn't know until it was too late. I didn't want to humiliate him. That would have been easy. No, I wanted something harder. For him to realize he had nothing to come home to, because he had treated home like a vault, not a bond. I spent afternoons with Grace on her back porch, bundled in wool blankets, watching squirrels chase each other through the trees. We didn't speak much. She understood the kind of grief that didn't want to be comforted, only witnessed. One evening she asked, "You ever want to talk to him again?" I shook my head. He's not who I thought I raised. Grace nodded, then said something I never forgot. "Maybe he is. You just finally saw him without the story." That night I wrote a letter. Short, not bitter, not pleading. Just final. "Jeremy, I cooked for you, prayed for you, held you through fear and failure. I gave you love without contract. You responded by planning my absence. I am not angry, but I am done. I may have raised you, but I no longer recognize you. Do not contact me. Do not come back. Helen." I sealed it, gave it to Russell. He'd deliver it after the house was transferred. Let Jeremy open that letter on the same day he discovered the locks were changed. This wasn't revenge. It was a rebalancing. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to be believed. I just needed to be free from the version of motherhood that demanded everything and returned nothing but paperwork and silence. I was no longer afraid of disappearing, because this time I was leaving on my terms. Jeremy came back 4 days too late. He walked into the hospital lobby in a charcoal suit that still had dry cleaning creases on the cuffs. He didn't look worried, just expectant, like a man coming to pick up a package. His voice was low but casual when he stepped up to the nurse's station. "I'm here to collect my mother's personal effects," he said. The nurse blinked, typed something. "She was discharged 4 nights ago," she said. "All her paperwork's been handled through her attorney." Jeremy's smile faltered. "Attorney?" She nodded. "Russell Dean. He left this envelope for you." She slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the desk like it was just another billing statement. Jeremy took it with a confident hand, but he didn't open it right away. Not until he was standing outside the hospital doors, back in the sun, the parking lot humming with ordinary life. Not until it felt safe. Inside the envelope was a letter. My letter. Jeremy. "You always assumed I wouldn't outlast your patience. You always assumed silence meant permission. You were wrong. I know everything, the documents, the manipulation, the breaks. I left you nothing. No signature, no affection, just one final line. I may have raised you, but I no longer claim you." Witnesses said he froze. One nurse paused as she walked by, then turned away quickly, the kind of look reserved for someone watching a ship sink in slow motion. He stood there for several minutes, still as a statue, holding a life he thought he owned, and realizing he never did. Jeremy didn't go home right away. He went to my house. Of course he did. He pulled up to the curb like he still belonged there, like the walls might lean toward him out of muscle memory. He walked up the porch steps, tried the doorknob, and found it locked, dead-bolted, reinforced. The brass plaque beside the doorbell read, "This property is under legal review. All inquiries. Kim and Associates." No more "Welcome, Matt." No porch light on, just silence, and a notice that said, "You're not welcome anymore." He circled the house once, calling someone on the phone, his voice rising and falling in muffled urgency. Then he found the second envelope, taped to the inside of the storm door, sealed, marked with his name in handwriting he'd recognize anywhere. He opened it. Inside, a printed deed. The new trust name. A one-line legal notice. This home no longer belongs to you. Do not return. Grace watched the whole thing from her living room window, her curtain barely open. She called me right after. He didn't cry, she said. Didn't yell either. Just looked around like he was trying to wake up from something. I asked, did he leave? He sat in his car for almost an hour, then drove off like he didn't know where to go. That night, I sat on the porch of my temporary cottage, the wind light against my face, the air holding a strange kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I didn't have to lock a door. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone to arrive late and act like I should be grateful for their presence. I was alone, but I wasn't abandoned. There's a difference. And if you've ever felt it, that moment you stop begging to be seen, you'll understand what I mean. Have you ever stopped fighting for someone's love because you realized you were the only one in the ring? Tell me below. You're not alone. Not anymore. Jeremy came back one more time. 2 days later, this time with a real estate lawyer in tow. He stood outside the house, pointing, gesturing, arms tight and frustrated. The lawyer made a call, waited, then looked up and said something that made Jeremy's shoulders drop. Grace didn't catch the words, but she saw the aftermath. Jeremy turned away, got back in his car, slammed the door. This time, he didn't drive off angry. He drove off slow, like someone leaving a funeral they hadn't expected to attend. He never got to scream, never got to confront me. That's what made it harder, I think. Because men like Jeremy, they're prepared for noise. They're ready to fight if it means they still get the last word. But what do you do when the door doesn't open? When the locks are changed? When the only sound left is your own conscience, echoing in a house that no longer remembers your name? I never raised my voice. I never raised my hand. I just raised the bar for how I would let myself be treated. That was the victory. Not in the headlines, not in the courthouse, but in the porch light that stayed off. Because it no longer waited for anyone who didn't knock with love. Jeremy used to have a way of talking that made people lean in. He was good at charming you. Teachers, neighbors, his father's friends. Always polite. Always the golden boy. But charm is a mask. And masks don't crack, they slide. Grace saw it happen before I did. The day after he got the letter, she watched from her window as he returned to the house. Not with flowers, not with grief, but with a clipboard. He was on the phone, pacing the front lawn like a man managing a business deal that had suddenly gone sideways. At one point, he turned to his girlfriend, the same one who once called me Mama Helen when I brought her lemon bars, and snapped, "You said she wouldn't change it." She fired back, arms crossed. "She wouldn't have, if you hadn't been so obvious." Grace told me about it later, her voice tight with something between satisfaction and sadness. "He finally showed his real face," she said, "and it's not one you want to invite inside." They argued for 20 minutes in the driveway. Jeremy's voice rose, not loud but sharp. Controlled anger, the kind that didn't explode, just simmered until everything around it boiled. "You said she was too sentimental," he hissed. "You told me she still saw me as her baby." His girlfriend lit a cigarette, eyes on the house. "Well," she muttered, "I guess she finally saw us for what we are." That line was the first time they admitted it out loud. They knew what they'd done, and they were just mad it didn't work. Jeremy came back again 2 days later, alone this time. He sat in his car for almost an hour, didn't move, didn't even smoke, just stared at the porch like it might forgive him. Then he walked to the door, tried the handle, still locked. He pulled out his phone, scrolled, typed, erased. Eventually, he took something out of his coat, a copy of the original will I had destroyed. He stared at it, long and hard, like maybe if he focused enough, the words would become real again. They wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. From the attic of Grace's house, we watched it unfold. I was sitting in a rocking chair, a blanket across my knees, tea cooling on the table beside me. It was like watching a man realize the key he'd held his entire life no longer opened anything. And worse, maybe it never did. He paced once, twice. Then, like a man trying to outrun his own reflection, he kicked the mailbox post. Grace raised her eyebrows. "Well, yeah," she said. "At least now he's stopped pretending." That night, I slept without dreaming, because something had settled in me. Not vengeance, not triumph, just stillness. For years, I had tiptoed around his moods, his cold silences, his excuses. I had explained away the distance, blamed adulthood, work, grief. But grief doesn't make you cruel. Grief doesn't make you erase someone who loved you. And now, he had no one left to blame, not even me. When I woke the next morning, Grace was already on the porch with a newspaper folded in half. She handed it to me with a small nod. Local man under investigation for elder fraud. I didn't need to read it. I already knew the story. I had lived it. And now it was his turn. When it starts, it's slow. First, a voicemail from a bank manager. Then a call from a private insurance firm. Then a certified letter that requires a signature Jeremy no longer has access to. Things don't collapse all at once. They rot from the inside. And eventually, something gives. That's what happened to Jeremy. I didn't have to lift a finger. The fraud alert came from the hospital's compliance officer. Apparently, Diane's quiet report, backed by Elliot's documentation, triggered a mandatory investigation into elder endangerment and attempted forgery. It was subtle at first. A review of login data, visitor badges, signature comparisons. Then it snowballed. They cross-referenced the forged will he'd tried to upload, traced the edits to a device tied to his home Wi-Fi, discovered the advanced directive file created the day after my crash. By the time his lawyer figured out what was happening, it was too late to spin. Russell sent me an update every Friday, just a short note. Week 1. The inquiry is now formal. He's been asked not to leave the state. Week 2. Hospital has provided full cooperation, witness statements recorded. Week 3, he's trying to claim you were mentally unstable. Our documentation says otherwise. Week 4, they've frozen the joint account. He no longer has access to your old estate. Each letter felt like a stone being lifted from my chest. Not because I needed him punished, but because I needed the truth to matter. Grace sat with me most evenings on the porch, her tea always too sweet, her words always just right. "You know," she said one night, watching the sun tip below the trees, "people think justice has to be loud." I didn't say anything. She kept going. But sometimes, the loudest justice is when the person who thought they had control realizes they don't even have a seat at the table. That's exactly what happened to Jeremy. He tried to spin it, of course, told friends I'd gotten confused, that I'd been pressured, that April had manipulated me into rewriting everything. But lies wear thin over time, especially when they're held up against paper trails, IP addresses, and a lifetime of entitlement. A local reporter picked up the court filing. It didn't go viral. There were no headlines on cable TV, just a quiet online article, buried beneath school board debates and water rate disputes. But the people who mattered saw it. His boss, his girlfriend's parents, his college buddies. The mask was gone. The final crack came when the court denied his petition to contest the will. The judge cited clear evidence of premeditated fraud and intent to displace the lawful estate owner. Russell sent me a copy of the ruling. I framed it, not for display, but for memory. Because when you've been gaslit long enough, even a court document can feel like a life raft. The best part? I didn't say a word. I didn't show up. I didn't testify. I didn't even watch the hearing. I was at Grace's garden planting marigolds. The sun was warm on my back. Birds were louder than the world's noise. And somewhere in a courtroom across town, a man who once whispered, "She won't last the year," was told he'd lost everything. Legally, officially, and forever. Maybe that's what quiet power looks like. Not gloating, not revenge. Just truth. Let loose, like a tide. It took its time. But it came anyway. The house wasn't mine anymore. Not legally, not on paper. I had transferred everything to April, but it still held my fingerprint, In the floorboards, the chipped windowsill above the kitchen sink, the spot near the stairs where Carl once carved our initials with a pocket knife. It wasn't about ownership. It was about returning, to see what remained of me. After they tried to scrub me out, Grace drove me. She offered to stay in the car, but I asked her to come in. Not because I was afraid, but because it felt right to walk back into that house with someone who never once asked me to shrink. April opened the door. She didn't say much, just wrapped her arms around me in that gentle, steady way of hers. The way daughters do when they're not trying to fix you, just hold you. "I didn't touch your room," she whispered. And just like that, I knew I hadn't come back to a house. I'd come back to something deeper. The guest room was exactly as I left it. Blue curtains, a faded quilt, my old Bible still on the nightstand, a dried daisy pressed between the pages of Psalms. But the kitchen? That had changed. The table had fresh paint. A new kettle sat on the stove. There were notes on the fridge, grocery lists in April's handwriting, and a magnet that said, "You are not hard to love." I looked at it for a long time, because after everything, after being told I was a burden, a cost, an afterthought, that small phrase felt like a light I hadn't known I needed. You are not hard to love. We spent the afternoon quietly. April made tea and let me rest in the sunroom. I watched the wind stir the curtains, listened to the faint laughter of children from the yard next door, let my bones settle into stillness. Then, just as dusk colored the walls golden, I asked April for a favor. "Would you drive me to the cemetery?" She didn't ask why. She just grabbed the keys. Carl was buried on the west side, lot 47 beside the willow tree. I hadn't visited in years, not because I didn't care, but because I was tired of speaking to marble when the people breathing had stopped listening. But now I had something to say. I stood there for a long time, both hands on my cane, letting the wind carry my words. "You'd be disappointed in him," I said, "but you'd be proud of me." I smiled, not with joy, but with resolve. I stopped begging to be seen. I stopped hoping he'd remember who I was, and I finally remembered it myself. I pressed one hand to the cool headstone and added, "I didn't fight for revenge. I fought for me." On the drive back, April asked softly, "Do you feel okay now?" I looked out the window, the road unwinding like a ribbon. "Not okay," I said, "but free." And there's a difference, isn't there? Sometimes what we need isn't for the pain to disappear. It's to know it doesn't define us anymore. Have you ever gone back to a place you were erased from, just to stand there whole again? Tell me below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read tonight. Back at the house, April tucked me in. She didn't hover, didn't ask questions, just kissed my forehead the way I used to kiss hers, light and certain. As she turned off the lamp, she whispered, "You're safe now, Mama." And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I believed her. I didn't announce it. There was no grand post, no letter, no list of resolutions. I just woke up one morning, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and realized I didn't flinch when my feet hit the floor. That was new, so I took it as a sign. That afternoon, I walked to the small bookstore 2 blocks from April's house. I hadn't stepped into one since Carl passed. The smell hit me first. Old paper, wood polish, faint cinnamon. It tugged something loose in me. I used to come here every month, back when Jeremy was in middle school. I'd buy him adventure novels, biographies of inventors. I thought filling his shelves meant I was filling something deeper, too. But he never kept them, never even dog-eared the pages. He used to say, "Books are too slow." I used to think, no, you just never needed to listen. The woman behind the counter had a braid of silver hair and a name tag that said Lorraine. She offered me tea, told me to take my time. I wandered past the poetry section, ran my fingers across spines with titles like The Art of Letting Go and Unfinished But Whole. One caught my eye. You Can Begin Again, quietly. I smiled, bought it. Didn't need to flip through the pages. The title said enough. April came home that evening to find me baking cornbread, not the boxed kind, the real kind, with buttermilk and cracked pepper, the kind I hadn't made in 10 years. "You feeling all right?" she teased, setting down her bag. "I'm starting to," I said. That night, we ate together. No TV, no background noise, just butter melting, steam rising, and a peace that filled more than the room. The next week, I signed up for a ceramics class at the community center. First time I touched clay, it felt like everything I hadn't said finally had somewhere to go. The instructor, a retired Navy cook named Judy, handed me a lump of earth and said, "Don't try to make it perfect, just make it yours." So I did. My bowl came out lopsided, ugly even, but when I brought it home and filled it with lemons, April stared at it like I'd brought home the moon. Some days, I still thought of Jeremy. Not in anger, not in pain, just from a distance. Like remembering a house you no longer live in, one where the wallpaper peeled and the room stayed cold no matter how high you turned the thermostat. I didn't miss him. I missed who I thought he might become. But people don't always grow the way you water them. And sometimes they choose the sun that burns over the one that patiently waits. At church the next Sunday, the pastor preached about restoration. Not the loud hallelujah kind, but the gentle kind. The kind that starts when you whisper, "I'm still here," even when no one's listening. He asked us to turn to the person next to us and say, "You have not been forgotten." I turned to April. She turned to me. Neither of us said it, but we both heard it. There's a power in starting over, without permission. No declaration. No audience, just you, just breath, just the next thing in front of you. Maybe it's a recipe, a library card, a dusty piano you once taught your child to play before he slammed the lid shut for good. Whatever it is, it's yours. And you don't owe anyone an explanation for picking it back up. I don't know where this new road leads, but for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid to walk it. Not because I've forgotten the pain, but because I finally stopped letting it lead me. It started with a letter, a real one, not an email, not a lawyer's envelope, just a plain cream-colored envelope with handwriting that slanted slightly left, like it was leaning into you. It came from a woman named Eliza Monroe, someone I hadn't spoken to in over 40 years. She was a nurse's aide when I volunteered at the county clinic in the early 80s. We shared shift coffee, traded casseroles during holidays, and laughed about the ridiculous things our husbands said in their sleep. Then life happened. Kids, moves, loss, we drifted, and now, this letter. She wrote, "I read something in the local paper. Not your name, but I knew it was you. You were always the one with the quiet backbone. I thought you might want to know. You were never invisible to me." That last line sat with me for hours, because when you spend enough time being treated like background noise in your own story, even a whisper of recognition feels like thunder. I called her the next morning. She picked up on the second ring. "Eliza Monroe," she said, like she was answering a rotary phone in 1983. I said, "This is Helen." There was a pause, then a breath. "Helen Hartley. Well, I'll be." We didn't need to explain anything, GSE. She just said, "Come to lunch. I make a mean chicken salad, and I still remember you hate celery." Her house was small, neat, and smelled like sun tea and dryer sheets. We sat on her porch under the shade of a creaking awning, swapping stories like no time had passed. She told me about her grandson who played saxophone, her daughter who just got her real estate license. I told her I was rebuilding, not out loud, but piece by piece. I told her about April, about ceramics, about the lemon bowl that looked like it survived a mild earthquake, but made me proud anyway. She listened, not out of pity, just presence. And that's something rare. Someone who sees your life not as a tragedy, but as proof you're still here. At one point, she asked, "Do you talk to Jeremy at all?" I shook my head. Her eyes didn't widen. She didn't gasp. She just said, "Some people walk away. Others have to be walked away from." That was it. No judgment. No attempt to make it better or worse than it was. Just truth. Handed to me like a glass of water. Later that week, she invited me to her book club. I almost laughed. Me? At a book club? The woman who hadn't finished a novel since Carl died? But I went. And I sat in a circle with 6 other women who looked like me. Faces lined with time, eyes full of things they'd never say out loud. We didn't talk about plot twists or symbolism. We talked about what it means to start over when nobody claps for you, about how silence can heal you or hollow you, depending on who hands it to you. After the meeting, one woman touched my arm gently and said, "You don't look broken. You look like you chose to come back." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled. Because how do you explain that sometimes survival isn't loud? Sometimes it's just a soft yes to living again. It took me decades to realize I didn't need to be rescued. I just needed to be seen. And this time, I was. Not by people who owed me, not by those who wanted something in return, but by women who knew. Women who had sat in similar chairs, stared at similar ceilings, and walked away from people who once called them mom, honey, useless. Maybe recognition doesn't always come from where we hoped. Maybe it comes quietly, from someone who once watched you hand out bandages and thought, "There's strength in her silence." And maybe that's enough. I didn't attend the final hearing. Russell offered to represent me, and I told him yes. There was nothing left to prove. Not to the court, not to Jeremy, and not even to myself. What needed to be said had already been lived. That morning, instead of sitting in a courtroom, I baked 2 loaves of banana bread, the old-fashioned kind. No shortcuts, just butter, eggs, and ripe fruit, so sweet it felt like second chances in a bowl. April came into the kitchen, her face still soft from sleep, and asked, "Big plans today?" I smiled. Just living. Later, we drove out to the edge of town, a quiet stretch where wildflowers grew on either side of the road and the air smelled like dirt and hope. I walked part of the trail near the river. My knees didn't like it much, but my spirit did. At one point, I sat on a bench beneath an oak tree, ran my hand across the weathered wood, and thought, this is what freedom feels like. Not noise, not revenge, just the absence of fear and the return of self. A week later, Russell called. The judge signed everything. Jeremy no longer has any legal claim to anything. Financial, medical, property. It's over, Helen. I thanked him, not because I needed a conclusion, but because he deserved to know he helped me reclaim something I hadn't held in years. My name. On my own terms. Jeremy never reached out. I imagine he wanted to. But not because he felt remorse. Because he couldn't believe I'd actually done it. Because men like him don't expect women like me to walk away without begging to be followed. But I didn't walk away for him. I walked for me. In the weeks that followed, I did more than I expected. I bought a new coat, red. Not for anyone's attention, just because I liked the way it felt on my shoulders. I started teaching children's story hour at the library twice a month. I took Grace to a concert, just a local jazz night, nothing grand, but we laughed more than we had in years. And most of all, I woke up each morning with no one's voice in my head but my own. That might not sound like much, but to a woman who spent decades filtering herself through someone else's approval, it's everything. The ceramic bowl I made now sits on the front table, filled with candy for neighborhood kids. One little girl asked if I bought it at a fancy store. I told her no, I made it myself. She looked at me like I was a magician. Maybe, in a way, I was. A few days ago, April framed a photo of me on the porch. Sunlight on my hair, my hands holding a teacup. Underneath it, she wrote, "She didn't make a scene. She made a life, Vinay." That's how I want to be remembered. Not as the woman who lost everything, but as the woman who found everything that truly mattered once she let go of needing to be chosen. I never wanted revenge, just room to exist. And now, I have it. If you're still here, maybe you know this feeling too. That quiet shift from sorrow to self-respect. That moment you realize healing doesn't ask for permission. It just walks through the door the minute you stop waiting for an apology. Tell me, have you ever walked away without turning around? Have you ever chosen peace? Not because they said sorry, but because you were done bleeding for the silence. Share your story in the comments. You never know who needs to hear it tonight. This may be just the end of Helen's story, but maybe it's the start of yours.